Hi, I'm James Batchelor, I'm an author, and this is a taster of my debut novella, Wandless. Chapter 1. Keep running. No matter what she heard behind her, she had to keep running. It was the only way to fend off the paralysis of fear. Emilia knew her footsteps were too loud. They pounded the earth, announcing her to the darkness, accompanied by the occasional loud rustle of bushes and shrubs as she barged past them. The leaves whispered loudly, cheerleaders to her escape, but no time to slow down and silence them. She had to keep running. The cold night air chilled her lungs. It was refreshing at first, but she knew it wouldn't be long before it started to burn. She needed to be far away by then, far enough to find somewhere to hide and catch her breath. Emilia had never been particularly active before she was sent to the sanctuary, and there had been no incentive or facilities to improve on that, but she was determined to push beyond her limits tonight. She had no choice. There was nothing more motivating than death. Her eyes focused on the darkness ahead, picking out vague shapes of bushes and trees, but her ears strained to hear what was behind her. Between the thumping of her footsteps, distressed voices called to each other. She couldn't make out the words, but knew what they were saying. She's escaped. Stop her. A dark wall loomed ahead, but the inconsistency of its blackness told her it was the tree line, not something solid. For so long she had peered at these trees through the fence, an almost daily ritual of wishful thinking. They had seemed so far, but she was already close enough to touch them. No time to savour the moment. Push through them and keep running. A sharp scrape along her shoulder showed the tree's disdain for her, offended by the lack of reverence. The pain lingered, a welcome distraction from the early indicators of fatigue. If they had fed her properly, if she was well rested, this sprint wouldn't have affected her so badly. But that was the point, wasn't it? Something soft, damp and loud came up to her waist as she thrashed through it. Emilia reached out to the sides and felt long stalks, some sort of crop, possibly wheat. It didn't matter what type, it was going to get her killed. Bright light punctured the darkness, scattered into angular beams by the trees behind her, and she could hear the growl of the quad bikes. It would be seconds before they pierced through this field and their headlights found her. Even if she hid, the trail she carved through the wheat would betray her. Despair threatened to grip her, force her to accept her fate, but there was something different about the air on this side of the trees. Maybe it was her imagination, but it tasted fresher, less icy than when she began to escape. There was a hint of warmth as well, but it wasn't oppressive. In fact, everything felt lighter, her head clearer. A numbing ache she hadn't realised was there had lifted, although the throbbing of her heartbeat remained. Then she understood. The suppression field. With every frantic step she took, every incremental increase in the distance between herself and the sanctuary, Emilia felt stronger. Her pulse transformed from desperation to determination, pumping with a forgotten power. The corners of her mouth twitched into a grin. The roar of the bikes killed any seeds of optimism. She was still outnumbered, outpaced, outgunned and out of options. One passed dangerously close to her, and she was shocked that she wasn't spotted. The noise of the bikes must be drowning out the rustling wheat. The drivers focused only on what they could see in the path of their headlights. Then the inevitable. Another bike came up from behind her, headlights bathing her in treacherous radiance. Something in her wanted to stop, to give up, but it was quickly overruled by the invigoration that grew as she moved further and further from the suppression field. Keep running. Wheat disintegrated around her before her brain processed the sounds of gunfire. Adrenaline afforded her another gear, and she briefly picked up speed, barreling towards the next tree line on the other side of the field. 5 more steps and she'd be there. The trees rustled in pain as bullets ripped through them, more thudding into the bark as she passed. Instinctively, Emilia reached out for a tree trunk to halt herself, ducking from sight. The trees were close together here, so the quad bikes would be forced further down the field's edge to wider gaps. Sure enough, they rumbled away, and Emilia was plunged into darkness again. She watched with a mix of fear and defiance as they swerved into the next wheat field and swung around. There was no way to get past them. More would be on the way soon if they weren't already. The bullet shells scattered through the devastated wheat behind her showed there was no interest in taking her back to the sanctuary alive. She hugged the tree, but somehow managed to hold back hopeless tears. No, it wasn't self-restraint controlling those tears. It was the rising strength that had been growing with every step. The fight-or-flight instinct that had been tearing her apart since first crossing the fence suddenly took a violent swing towards the former. No longer was she despairing. She was determined, not fearful, but furious, and far more powerful than they realised. It had been years since Emilia had used her magic, but muscle memory kicked in, and she quickly felt that familiar warm glow from the pit of her stomach. Reaching deep within herself, she focused on that feeling and fueled it, until it filled her chest, her shoulders, and spilled into her arms. Every inch of her skin tensed, until she was unsure whether she was being suffocated by her own body or trying to burst out of her fleshy prison. She had forgotten this exquisite cocktail of pain and pleasure. The quad bikes were advancing, nearly back to the tree line, their searchlights scanning the length of the field. Still hiding behind a thick trunk, Emilia could feel them out there. 4 of them, 3 men, 1 woman, in a perfect horizontal line. It was too dark to see them as anything more than menacing silhouettes, yet in her mind she could picture every detail. Another force fueled her power of perception, one she now remembered how to channel. Some of her companions back at the sanctuary were once able to perceive emotions and even unspoken thoughts, but that gift still eluded her. Even without it, she could sense how determined they were to find her. She stepped out from behind the tree into the light, blinded but only in terms of her optical sight. "She's there," one of the men called. "The carrier." "What are you waiting for?" the woman replied, evidently the leader. Their words were muffled as Emilia concentrated. Without a wand to channel her power, she was forced to use her hands, stretching out to direct the magic through tense fingers. She hadn't done this since she first started developing her gift as a teenager. As soon as anyone showed signs of her magical abilities, they were issued with a wand to keep it under control, to direct it more accurately. At least that used to be the case. Her hands shook as she struggled to restrain her power, to focus it. Part of her wanted to fully unleash just to see what happened, but horror stories of untamed magic ripping its user apart held her back. That had been another reason the wands were issued, for the user's safety. The key, she remembered, was to concentrate on a specific task, or in her case, specific objects. Over the aggressive growl of the quad bikes, she could just about hear the pathetic click of a mechanical failure. "My gun's jammed," the driver on the far right shouted. "Mine too." "It's her," the woman scowled. "She's too far from the suppression field." "What do we... Whoa!" The 2 end drivers cried out in unison as their bikes began to lift into the air and towards each other. All 4 of them shouted over each other, but Emilia tuned this cacophony out and concentrated on lifting the other 2. Her power hadn't put her body under this much pressure since long before she was captured. Locking 4 rifles and moving 4 quad bikes was tough, even before years without magic. The bikes were heavy, more in mental effort than physical weight, but every inch she managed to move them gave her fresh strength. Emilia's face bunched up tightly. No need to visibly see her enemies while their pulsing forms took shape in her mind. She found new reserves within herself and sped up the bike's flight. Over the throbbing in her ears, the pulsing ache at the front of her skull, the drivers screamed in panic as they hurtled upwards. She had expected them to jump clear of their vehicles, but they clung on until it was too late to do so. With a twist of her outstretched hands, the 4 bikes flipped over and she released them. The sudden relief threatened to make her collapse, but she stood firm. The fall sent the soldiers' screams up several octaves, but only for a second. A crunch of metal and bone marked the impact of each quad bike, a short but awful rhythm that echoed through the night air. Silence. Emilia didn't know if the drivers were unconscious or dead, nor could she process her feelings if they were the latter. There was no time to celebrate or feel relief. The sanctuary was still too close enough to have heard the crash, which means more soldiers would be on the way. Not that she couldn't handle them now. Emilia kept running. That's the first chapter of Wandless. It's an urban fantasy thriller, and you can find out more at wandless.co.uk. Thank you.